Now, this particular pattern is it's got a lot of talks behind it because you read online and there's a lot of different implementation, a lot of different meaning of what this pattern does. But I found a meaning online which firmly represent how I want to use it, and it goes by saying something like this: a repository represents an architectural layer that handles communication between the application and the data source. It is widely used. It is a widely used pattern whose main point is that the application does not have to know which data source is implemented and how it is implemented. This makes it easy to switch to another data source or implement structural changes to the existing data source, which is my exact use case. I want this pattern to act as a mediator or act as a middleman between my data and my front end controllers. I don't want to put my CRUD functions in my controllers. I want something else in between to do that. And that's where this repository comes in because it's going to even abstract away more of some tediousness that you would do in your controller. Like you could, if you're trying to fetch an object by an ID, you can imagine that you have to do a lot of different method calls to get that data. The repository is going to expose method, or my repository is going to expose method that makes that process very easy by using one method to get all the results that you need. All right, so that is my use case for this pattern. It's what I'm going to implement. Again, there's a lot of different implementation, but my implementation is going to be fairly simple, and I think you guys will understand it once you see it. But before even that, I forgot that I needed a factory in my entity manager, which I don't think I did create it, but we didn't actually put no code in it. So let's quickly do that. Again, it's going to be a similar approach to all of the factory classes that we've created so far. So we're going to declare strict type equal 1, namespace, that's Magma, and we're in our entity manager. Yep. That's going to be class entity manager factory. And this is going to take, we'll create two protective property. And it's going to be, the first one's going to be protected, and it's going to be our data mapper interface. Yep. It's called data mapper. And the second one is going to be protected, and it's going to be our query builder interface. And you can see it pulled those in. Once we created the interface, it locates them in their namespace and it pulls it in for us automatically, which is very good, very cool. Query builder. And again, we're going to have a constructor, but this time, unlike our other factories, this one is going to pipe these properties to our constructor arguments. So I'm going to say public function construct, and the first argument is going to be data mapper interface, data mapper, and we're going to have a query builder interface, query builder. Right, so we are now going to pipe these properties to these variables. So this data mapper equal data mapper, and this query builder equal query builder. Now we're going to create our create method for our factory, which is going to be public function create, and this is going to accept a few arguments, a couple of arguments. The first I'm going to say string, and I want to get the CRUD object. So it's going to be CRUD object. The second is going to be a string, and I want to get the table schema. And you're going to see where we hook this up in a bit. And the third argument is also a string. That's going to be a table schema ID. And we got a fourth argument, which is just an array of options. And I can't remember if we use this options or not. And I'm going to set it as optional. Right? So say CRUD. Should check CRUD object. Actually, let's change this to string like we've done in all of our other factories. So we're going to create an object from this actual string that we're going to pass in when we come to instantiate this factory. So we're going to say CRUD object equal new CRUD string, and we're going to pass in a couple of arguments. We're going to pass in this data mapper. We're going to pass in this query builder. We're going to pass in our table schema and our table schema ID. Right? I'm going to say if CRUD object isn't an instance of that CRUD interface, then we're going to kick you out, not allowed, or throw a new exception. Throw new, and what did we do again for all of our other factories? We're just throwing an exception. So I'm going to throw new CRUD exception. Right? We've not even got any exception in this directory. Let's create a directory called exception, and we're going to create entity manager exception .php. Declare strict types equal 1 namespace magma entity manager exception, and we're going to say class entity manager exception, which is going to extend exception, just like that. And let's actually use our entity manager exception right here. Let's actually be explicit. CRUD exception. It feels like I'm going a little bit OTT with all these different classes and exceptions, but this is part of creating a solid structure from day one, which is what we're trying to employ. So declare strict types. I'm going to say namespace magma entity manager exception class CRUD exception, and I'm just going to extend from the entity manager exception. Right? And that should be fine for now. So use our CRUD exception. Let's get rid of that. Let's format this a little bit because I like the longer text on top. Just like that. So we throw in an exception, and we're going to say CRUD string is not a valid CRUD object, something generic like that. I'm going to say we're going to return that object. So I'm going to say return entity manager, because this factory we're instantiating this entity manager object. It's not right, so we're going to say return new entity manager, and we just want to pass in that CRUD object. And this is going to return our entity manager interface, like that. And we've got a long text. Let's put that at the top. That is cool. Let's also bring in our interface. Entity manager interface. Let's put this under the button right here. Yep. Actually, we're not even using that, so let's get rid of that. Right. So we are creating our factory, which is going to create an object of that entity manager class, and we're going to pass in that CRUD object. So if I take you back to entity manager, you can see that we need that CRUD interface, we need that CRUD object, which is what we pipe to our property and then return it, right? That's basically what we're doing right here. And you can see our CRUD class, that takes in a few arguments as well. So if I go to my CRUD, you see we've got 4 arguments, which is what we're putting, which is what we're instantiating. Oh, no, that's not the right word. Which is what we're passing to this CRUD object as an argument. So passing that data mapper, that query builder, that table schema, and the table schema ID, which is what the constructor is asking for, which is what we've piped these properties to, so we can use it within our CRUD methods. So I'm hoping that's making sense. Or we've got about hooking these factories up, and we're sort of like creating these objects and what arguments we're passing. So we did quite a lot there a while ago. So I want to push this to git status, git add, git commit. And what we've just done is we've added entity manager factory. And I'm going to push this, git push origin master. Yep, and that should have been updated on Git. So let's close that out. Again, we're going to come back to the self-documenting in a bit, but again, we can just quickly do this to grab all the arguments. Yep, and then we'll come back and self-document it. Just like that. And what does it do for these properties? Nothing. Right. Save that. That's our factory created. I'm going to close these out, close that out, close that out, and close that out. So as I said, the next bit of our liquid ORM that I want to implement is our repository. So I'm going to call it new folder data repository. Now, let me reiterate again, this is not exactly required. I can pretty much use what I've got in my entity class to pull that data from in my controller if I wanted to. But I want to create that middleman so I can make changes in the back that without affecting the code on the front, if that makes sense, or affecting the implementation from our controllers. So data repository, and this is going to again contain a data repository interface .php. We got our data repository .php, and this also got a factory. I'm going to call it data repository factory.php. We've got some exceptions, so let's create that directory. Exception, and let's create data repository exception.php. And let's just quickly populate this, because again, we will come back to these exceptions and we will sort of like make them a little bit more specific, but for now this will suffice. Namespace, I'm going to say magma within that liquid, change that to data repository. Yep, and we're in that exception directory. Say class data repository exception, which is going to extend exception. Save that out, close that for now, and let's look at our interface, or start implementing some of the method that we're going to expose to our data repository class. So I'm going to say PHP declare strict types equal 1 namespace magma, and have we got that repository? Yes, we have. We'll need this repository. So class, not class, it's an interface data repository interface. All right, now off my head, I know there's quite a few classes that I've actually created within this interface, because I think I went a little bit crazy trying to abstract away as much as possible. So we're going to create a few and you will see. So the first one is a method that you might see in frameworks like Laravel, and it's going to be find. And this find method is going to find and return an ID, return an item by its ID. So the argument that we need to put in there is going to be an int and ID, because we're finding an element by its ID. This is going to return an array, right? Second one going to be public. It's going to be find all, right? That's also going to return an array, but this one doesn't have any argument. We're just going to find all result from a database table and return it and just dump it all. Next one will be public function, and it's going to be find by. So we're getting a little bit more specific, and this is also going to return an array. And we've got a lot of arguments in this particular method. So the first one is going to be array selectors, and it's going to be optional. We've got array conditions, that's also optional. We got array parameters, that's also optional. We've got an array optional, which is optional. And this is familiar, right? We've seen this pattern before, and we're sort of like mimicking that method that we've got, that read method in our CRUD class, and you're gonna see how we're going to use this find by to actually filter out results, or filter out results based on our arguments that we passed in. And the next one that we've got is public function find one by, and this is going to take an array of conditions, and it's going to return an array. And find one by takes an array, so we can find, for example, we could say find email by that argument that's coming in, or find ID by that argument, or find whatever is it we're trying to find by what. This method will provide the means to do that. And we got our next one, which is called public function, and this is called find object by. Right, and this takes an array, it's got conditions, which is optional, and an array of selectors, which is optional, and this is going to return an object. Other ones we've got is public function find by search, and again it returns an array. You can see it's like I'm in love with these arrays. It's a nice way of working. I'm going to say array selectors, which is optional, and I've got some array which is conditions, optional, got array parameters, which is optional. And as I'm typing this, I've noticed that this method is sort of like reflecting this method up here, because we're sort of like passing in the same arguments. So I will actually see if we could combine those two methods together, but for now this is how I've done it. I'm going to roll with it, then we're going to refactor, fine tune, and make it better. So say array optional, which is optional. I'm not going to create all these methods now. I'm going to create some, then we're going to come back and create the others. The other ones I've got in here is public function, and we want to find by an ID and delete, which is pretty self-explanatory. And this is just a bool. It's going to return true or false, right? So this takes an array of conditions and an integer, which is an ID. So public function, and it's going to be find by ID and update. Again, a bool, and this is going to take two arguments. It's going to be an array, the condition, which is optional, and int, which is an ID. Actually, this find by ID and delete only takes one argument, so we don't need that ID. And the next one is going to be public function, and say find, and what's it called? Find with search, and paging. And this is one of my favorite method, and I'm going to actually talk you guys through this one when we come to implement it, because this method is quite powerful. It does quite a lot, and the code is very simple. And returns an array, and it only takes two arguments, and the first is an array of arguments and the second is an object, which is our request object. And this bit is where we're going to bring in Symfony HTTP Foundation component, because we're going to actually rely on that to get our request and response objects. And I'm going to create a wrapper class that wraps around that object, because just like we did with PDO, create a wrapper class for that, we're going to do a wrapper class for any external libraries that we bring into our project, so we can keep them in one location centrally. So if something changes with that, we've only got the one place to change it. And next one, public function, we got find and return. I don't think I've actually used this method, so I might not even implement this, but for now we're going to leave it. And I remember this was a method that was chainable, so it returns self and takes two arguments. The first is an integer, which is the ID, an array of selectors, which is optional. Right, so I'm going to leave it as it is for now. I mean, let's count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we've got 10 methods between our repository interface, and it's a good starting point. So I'm going to go into our repository, start building that out. To declare strict type equal 1 namespace magma. See if we've got a bit of help. Yep, data repository class data repository, which implements that data repository interface. And let's bring that data repository interface in. And the reason why you see we're getting this error is because what it's saying is that we've got 10 methods which we've not implemented, and obviously we've not implemented them yet. So we're going to see this line that says error. Use magma data repository interface. Again, I like to be explicit by calling in the actual class, even though we don't need it because they're in the same directory. I like to just bring them in just to be explicit. And I said that word quite a lot. So what we got right here is our class, and we're ready to start implementing these methods. But before we do that, we got a property that we need to bring up. So it's going to be a protected property, and it's going to be that entity manager interface, and I'm just going to label this as EM, very short, right? And we've got a constructor, public function construct, and this taking that interface, or type int that interface, entity manager interface, and it's going to be EM. Right, we're going to pipe this EM to this constructor argument. So what we've just done right here, when we create our factory, we're going to create an object of our repository, and we're going to pass in the entity manager interface. And what this is going to do is going to give us access to this method, this get CRUD method, so we can access our CRUD method within our CRUD class. Right? So I want to create two helper functions just to do some checking. And the first one, I'm going to make them private. And again, when we come to do stuff like our traits, where we keep all of our common classes, we can refactor, we can put these little helper methods within those classes so we can reuse them throughout. But again, we're going to build for now, and then we're going to refactor later on. So it's going to be a private function, and it's going to be called isArray. And this takes in a argument which should be an array and of conditions. Again, returns void, and all we're doing is saying if the passed in argument is not an array, then we want to throw an exception. Throw new, I'm going to say data repository invalid argument exception. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to actually pass an argument or a message that says the argument supplied is not an array. Put a semicolon. And the second method that I want to create, we're getting that error because we have not yet got that exception class created. Or have we? No, we haven't. So we'll go ahead and create that. And paste that. PHP declare strict type equal 1 namespace. Say magma. We're in our data repository exception. Say class. Paste that in. I'm going to extend invalid argument exception. Yep. So we need to bring that class in to our repository. So I'm going to say use magma exception. Bring that in like that. The next one's going to be a private function is empty. That's going to take an int. It's going to check against an integer, which is going to check against an integer, and the argument is going to be ID. And again, this is going to return void. And we're going to say if empty ID, we're going to throw new data repo invalid argument exception. I'm just going to say argument should not be empty. So that's our two helper method that we're going to implement. Again, as I said, when we come to do the traits with the common classes, we're going to put these two methods in, because I remember earlier on we did actually create something similar like this. So we're trying to keep our code as dry as possible. So we're going to be implementing these within a trait PHP trait class that's going to pass common functions around, that's going to pass common methods around all of our classes when we need them. So the first method that we got is the find, and we said that's going to return an array. We're going to give it some body, and the first thing we're going to check is we're going to say this is empty ID, right? Because this method argument is the ID, and in order for this to work, it needs an ID. So if you've not got an ID, it's going to say no ID, then going to throw an exception. I'm going to say try. Again, try catch block, and we're going to use the throwable again. Going to throw it, throwable. Then we're going to throw that variable, and we need to define. Oh well, there we go. It pulls it in already for us. Then all I'm going to say is return this find one by, which is our next method that we haven't created yet, and we're going to pass that argument in ID by the argument ID, and that's as simple as it gets for this particular method. So we're going to go ahead and actually implement that find one by. It's going to be public function find one by, and find one by, and that takes just a single argument, which is an array of conditions, and that also returns an array. And we're going to say this is array and pass that conditions in. So if it's not an array, we're going to throw an exception. I'm going to say try catch again, or throwable. Then we're going to throw that variable. And we're going to say return this em. Remember, em is this property that we now bind to this entity manager interface. And once we do that, we can access that get CRUD method in that class. And from that method, we then got access to our CRUD method, which is, and the one that we want to get is the read method. All right, and let's just follow it back. So this em, which is this class entity manager, we're going to get this method, get this CRUD method, right? And on that CRUD method, we're going to call our read method within our CRUD interface, within our CRUD class. And remember how we hooked that up. We've hooked that up through, let's get this back, through one of our factories. So let's close that out. And that's been hooked up through, not this class, yet through this class. So it's been hooked up through this entity manager factory, where we are passing in our CRUD object, right? So that's how we are able to get access to get CRUD and get the method from that CRUD class. And if you remember, this method takes in four optional arguments, but we won't be using all of them within this method. We only got the conditions. So what we're going to do is, because the conditions is set as a second argument right here, so what we're going to do is we're going to do an empty array to jump past the first argument and get to the second, and then we're going to pass in conditions. And that's it. That's this method complete. So we're finding one by, using the read method, we're passing in the conditions that we want to find that result by, and returning it. And then we'll take this method and we use it within this find method to even fine tune it even more. So being specific. So we're saying we want to find one by the ID, right? We can use this method and find it by anything. We could find by email, name, whatever. But this find method is very specific. We're finding by the ID. And that's how abstract that we're going to make this. So it becomes easy to actually get the result that you want. And what else have we got? So let's close these out. I like to scroll to the top and then close the page. So when it opens and starts at the very top. That's why I'm always scrolling to the top before I close the page. Let's close this for now because we're not ready for that yet. And next method that we need is find all. Let's put that underneath this to be public function find all. And what we're going to do with this, we're going to say try catch, again throwable. I'm going to throw that throwable. And all we're going to do in this method is return this em again to get CRUD and we want to return that read method again, but this time we're going to pass no arguments to it because we want it to get all the results. There's no condition, just fetch, just dump everything that we've got in that table that we're trying to fetch the data from, right? And the next method that we got down in this line is find by, and that contains a few ID. Let's just copy this out and paste it where have we got that, just after find all. Paste it there. I'm going to give it a body, and it returns an array. Yep, cool. Again, or try catch block. I'm going to do throwable again. I mean, you're getting the point of what we're doing now, and we're going to throw that throwable. So we're catching any exception and just throwing it out. Are we going to return this em get CRUD, and we want to use that read method again, but this time we're going to pass in all the conditions. So when we come to use this find by method, we can tailor or be specific to what we're trying to fetch from the database. So we're going to pass in all these arguments: selectors, conditions, parameters, and optional. And that is it for this particular method. Why are we getting an error on here? So we've got a find all. Again, yeah, we're not stating the return type, which is an array. Again, we need to do this because that's exactly how we've implemented it in our interface. So it has to reflect, or it has to be the same in our class. And what have we got next? We've got find all, find by, find all, find by, find one by, and find object by, which is the next one. Again, let's just copy this and paste it and give it a body. And this method actually, there's something that's missing that I've not implemented, and it's a get method within our CRUD. And I know get is not part of the CRUD, but it's something I added in because I wanted to get a result by an object. So we're going to leave that out for now until we've actually implement that method within our CRUD. So let's jump past that one for now and find by search. And this one again is going to, let's just copy this, paste it, give it a body, the word try catch block, I'm going to say throwable. It's going to throw that throwable. Do you see how quickly I'm typing now with these extensions that I've put in? I'm still making some keyboard errors, but it seems to be going a lot quicker by doing all code completion for me. It's quite cool. So find by search, again, I want to use this helper method. This is array. I want to check the conditions. Right, I want to make sure my conditions is an array. And what we're going to return is we're going to return this em get CRUD, and we want to call our search method, right? So I'm going to say search, and we're going to pass in the arguments. So it's going to be selectors and conditions, got parameters and optional, because we can we can search via conditions. We can add parameters like we want the results to be ordered by this or that, and the optional is going to take in stuff like pagination, like the offset on the limit. So we can give our search page like pagination if there's quite a lot of results. So that's why we've got all these arguments, because they're doing something specific. And the next one we've got is find by ID and delete. Let's copy that. Give it a body. And what we need to do is, I guess, a bool. So we're going to say this is array conditions. So we're saying if it's not an array, return or throw an exception. And again, like all the other methods we've created so far, I'm going to wrap it in the try catch block. Again, do I need to do this try catch block? Debatable. I don't know, because I've already done try catch block in my CRUD, right? So again, this is open to debate. Is it necessary? I've just gone with it because it does work, and I'm just trying to implement some good practice by trying to catch any error that could occur. And use throwable. And find by ID and delete. So what we're trying to do is we're going to create a variable called result, and we're going to say this, and we're going to use one of these methods up here, which is the find one by. We're going to pass in that conditions argument up here. Then we're going to say if results or result, if result isn't null and count result is greater than 0, then I want to create an next variable, say delete equal this em get CRUD, and we want to call that delete method. Right, I want to pass that conditions in. Got an error there, should be and delete. So if at least one row was affected, then going to return true. Right? So we're getting the result via the conditions. If we've got any result, then we're going to delete it, is what we're saying. And the next method is find by ID and update, and this is going to be quite similar to our previous method. Lost it. Copy, paste, create the body, and we're going to do the same thing. So this is array conditions, right? Is it called conditions? Find by update. That shouldn't be conditions, actually. That should be fields, because we're updating the fields. So we need to change that variable name to fields. Fields, yep, that's much more descriptive. And again, get our old trusted try catch block. Do a throwable. We're going to throw this throwable. And again, we're going to implement a similar sort of like concept. So result is equal to find one by, and So we're going to find one by the ID, which is the ID in the argument. Yeah. So whatever ID we specify, we want to find a item by that ID. If we've got any result, or if it's not null, if the result is not null, meaning that we've got something and count result is greater than 0, then we want to say define some params, and this is going to say equal isn't empty fields. Then I'm going to merge this ID bind to ID and the fields, right? Else just return the fields. I think that's right. So let's say update equal this em get CRUD, and we want to call the update. I want to call the update method. Yeah. I'm going to pass the parameters in, and we also want to pass in the primary key for that particular table. And I'm going to hard code it for now, but I am going to come back to this because we need to make this dynamic so we can specify what field we want to find by, or what field we're trying to update, because it could be a different field. It doesn't have to be the ID. Or if we've created a different column name in our database tables, so for example UID or user ID, we want to make sure that we can cater for that. And at the moment we've got ID hard coded. Yeah. And if we take it back to my CRUD, we're saying get schema ID, and that's actually what we could do. We're going to say this em get CRUD get schema ID, and that should actually solve that problem, because this is going to return a string of whatever our ID column is. So let's just copy this and paste it where we've all coded ID. Copy, paste, just paste. I hope you're getting what I'm doing right here. So this method that we've created, get schema ID, returns the ID of the table, and we're going to specify this within our application, because our CRUD needs to know what table we're working in and what our primary key is for that table. So that's what these two methods are doing, and these two methods has to be implemented in our application in order for us to know what the ID is and what the table is. So we can pull that information from these methods, this get schema ID, and you can see in our CRUD classes we're using the get schema, which is the name of the table. All right. I hope you're getting that. It seems complex, but it's not really. And that's just going to return a string, which is what our method, actually it's not returning a string. It's primary key. It's returning a string, which is what we're specifying as a second argument right here. And if we go into get schema ID, you can see that we are returning a string. We can be even explicit and say string, just to make sure that that is an actual string. We'll do it for that as well. String. So we're being very explicit. So if there's any chance that this is not a string, let's make sure that it is a string by wrapping string within these parentheses, which is just PHP functions or PHP, functions. Yeah. So that should take care of our hard code bit. So it's now much more dynamic, right? So what else have we got? So we're saying update this get CRUD, fire update method, pass in these parameters and specify the primary key. So we're saying if fields isn't empty, let's merge our ID and value with the fields. Let's merge them together. Or if the field is empty, that's not true. That's not true. Let's look at this again. So if field isn't empty, we want to merge this array, yeah, with the fields. Else just return the fields. Right, that's correct. And we shoot off a next, we create a next variable saying update, passing the parameters and passing the primary key. So we're going to say if that was successful, then return true. So, which is the bool, so returning true. I think that is it for this method. So what else have we got? We've got find with search and paging. Now this method right here is going to, I probably won't create it right now because it's going to take quite a lot of imagination, because it's doing quite a bit of function. It's doing quite a bit. It's doing our pagination. It's going to do our table sorting. It's going to do our counting or result counting. It's going to do our query search, and it's going to also return our database results. And it sounds like a lot, but the code is going to be very simple. But if I go ahead and create this now, it's not going to make any sense to you whatsoever, because we've got this object which we've not yet even touched. We've not even come across touching it yet, because this is going to be our Symfony component which we've not even installed yet as a dependency to our framework. So for the time being, we're going to leave the repository as it is. We've gotten a couple of errors because we've not implemented all the classes, all the methods. So let's just throw these in to, not get any errors. And I'm just going to give it some body. Alright, and that should effectively take care of, well, we'll still get an error because we're not really returning anything. Let's just return an empty array. That should solve that. And let's just return this, and that should solve that. And that's all the errors gone for now. But obviously we're going to be coming back to implement that class. And this as well is something else that we need to implement. And can we do this? Yeah, so we're gonna leave it at that. No, we can't do that actually. Speak too soon. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We know what this error is. It's because we've not got a return type, because we've not implemented the method yet. So let's not worry about that for now. Let's close that out. Scroll to the top and close it, and let's implement our factory. Right, so let's start off again with the tedious part. PHP declare strict types equal 1. I'm gonna say namespace, and we're going into Magma, and we're within our liquid ORM, or in our data repository. And I've just realized that I've also made another error on my namespace. Did I actually put this liquid ORM in? Oh, I did actually. I thought I didn't, but I did. It's there. Fine, cool. Let's crack on. And where are we? We're in our data repository directory. That's cool. Yeah, so I'm gonna say class. So data repository factory. And there's a couple of properties that we need to pass in, and they're all going to be protected. So I'm going to say protected string, and I'm going to say data, not data, we call it table schema. Next one is protected string. It's going to be table schema ID, and the third one is going to be a string as well, and going to be your CRUD identifier. Again, probably don't need this. It's just something that I've learned and something that I've implement, and it doesn't really do nothing significant. So I will show you what it's doing when we come to putting these together. So our factory is going to have a constructor. I'm going to say construct, and again we're going to pass in that string. I'm going to say CRUD identifier. I'm going to say string, and say table schema string table schema ID, right? And let's pipe these properties to these constructor arguments. So this CRUD identifier equal CRUD identifier, and this table schema equal table schema, this table schema ID equal table schema ID. So we're going to go ahead and create the next method within our factory, and that's going to be public function, and it's going to be the create method, which is the same method name we've used within all of our factories so far. And this is going to take one argument, and that's going to be our data object, or our repository object. So it's going to be a string. I'm going to say data repository string. Right? So now I can say data repository object equal new data repository string, which is our data repository, because we are using our factory to create an object of this class. And in the constructor of that class, you notice that we've got our interface for entity manager, but we won't be inputting that just yet, because there's something else that we need to create, which is going to gel all of this together. Then we're going to come back and put it in so you can see exactly what we're doing. So likewise, we're going to say if data repo object is not an instance of our data repository interface, again we're going to kick you out. We're going to throw an exception, and this is going to be, again I keep forgetting, this is going to be like all other factories, just going to throw a normal exception. So it's going to be data repository exception. Yeah, it's going to say data, get a string variable, say is not a valid repository object. So effectively what we're saying, we're allowing this repository to be extended externally, but in order to do that we need to sign a contract, and that is that data repository interface. So if we've not signed that contract, we will not be able to extend or change some of the function externally. So we have to sign that contract, and if we've not, we're going to say data repository string is not a valid repository object. And what we need to do next is need to return that object, which is that data repository object. Right, let's return that. And as I'm saying, there's other bits to this that needs to be implemented, which we've not created yet. So I'll create those and then we'll return back to this class and complete it. But you can see that it's shouting out for this to be called in. So we're going to bring that in. Use Magma, data repository exception, and data repository exception right there. And that fixes that. So at the minute we've got our layer of data repository which we can use within our controller classes, which is something we've not yet done. And I want to get this to a point where we can actually simulate how these methods work within a application environment. So let's just clear up some errors. Again, that's not really an error. We know what that is. Let's scroll to the top, close it out. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Scroll to the top and close it out. Let's open up a file. You see, when I open it, it starts at the top. If I'm at the bottom and I close it and I reopen it, it starts at the bottom. I don't really want that. I want it to start at the very top. That's why I'm always scrolling to the top, then close the file.